Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a fabulous story tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, when my mother had her first stroke in July of 1996, even though I was 18 years old at the time, I knew something was seriously wrong with her, but my mother was in complete denial. I sneakily suspect this was because she had an intrinsic fear of doctors. My mother was pretty much in denial about many things in her life, which also included her age, her weight, and any numbers connected with blood sugar or blood pressure. She had ceased to remember how old she was on purpose, and refused to get on a scale, so that she wouldn't have to witness the ugly numbers, revealing the horrifying truth of her steadily increasing waistline. It was so much better as far as she was concerned, being ignorant about things you'd rather not know about, because if you pretended the problem didn't exist, maybe it would mysteriously just disappear and go away from her life, melt away like the butter on a warm bagel. My mother was a little on the plump side. She wasn't a big woman, but she was carrying about 50 pounds of extra weight that it wouldn't have harmed her to lose. She would tell me she never ate anything after she'd packed away an entire loaf of brown bread and peanut butter with jelly as a snack. She'd be genuinely mystified as to how she could have been putting on weight when she told me in no uncertain terms that she ate like a mouse. I knew very well she didn't eat like a mouse, but more like a hungry, rabid dog, with extensive portion sizes. She regularly cleaned out the pantry until all that was left was the staples like dried pasta, tinned tomatoes and rice. Once she munched a whole packet of cat pellets that I'd put in a plastic container, as the bag had broken and fallen apart. She hadn't realized that they were cat biscuits. "Please remind me never to get those again," she said. "Those are far too fishy for my liking." Years ago I had clandestinely discovered my mother's secret stash of chocolates, candies, cookies, chips and peanuts that she hid discreetly in a box in her closet. But I never confronted her about her dirty little secret. The truth was that I often raided her stash myself for a candy bar or a treat of some kind, so I wasn't going to protest about something I could enjoy the benefits of myself. "I eat so terribly little," she would complain, "but unlike your Aunt Jane, even though she's my non-identical twin, I'm the unfortunate one that is biologically impaired. I've inherited a crap metabolism. How fair is that, I ask you? Why do I always draw the short end of the straw? My body has an inability to burn calories. It simply looks at food and hoovers the energy up, placing it directly into my fat cells, without any discrimination." "Mum, you're being ridiculous. You're in such denial, but you're not fooling anyone," I would say. "I cannot think what you're talking about, Juvenna," my mother said to me. "Can you not see, theoretically, I should look much the same as my twin sister Jane does? But I don't. Explain that conundrum to me, will you? I'm at least 80 pounds heavier than your aunt. Your Aunt Jane can look at food and just lose weight. When I look at food, my fat cells perversely inflate like a hot air balloon on takeoff. It's a cruel world we live in, Juvenna, and I'm sorry, but God does play favourites." "Don't be ridiculous, Mum. God loves us all exactly the same." "That is not true, Juvenna. I think God decided I was meant to be porky. I had to be the porky one out of the two of us. I can't for the life of me understand why we are twins, me and your Aunt Jane. Yet my metabolism is flailing badly on me." "Mum, you're talking nonsense. You've got a fabulous metabolism. There's nothing wrong with it at all. You eat a lot. That's your problem. Most people, if they ate as much as you, would be 3 times heavier than you are. I'm sure you and Aunt Jane have identical metabolisms, but unlike you, Aunt Jane doesn't get desperate to snack all the time. I bet she's never accidentally raided the cat pellets like you did that time. Don't you remember?" My mother groaned. You love telling everybody about that, don't you, Juvenna? Look at the smirk on your face. You don't look half pleased with yourself. I bet you've told all your friends at school that your mother ate the cat pellets. You love humiliating me, don't you, Juvenna? You get some kind of a rise out of it. You've got to admit it is funny, Mum. Only you could ever eat a bag of cat pellets and not even know what you were eating. They weren't fit for human consumption, I don't suspect. So what if I told my friends about it? They thought it was hilarious too. So on this day, when I noticed the troubling droop of my mother's mouth on one side of her face, I was naturally convinced my mother had had a stroke and told her as much. I was no medical expert, of course, but I did know about the symptoms of a stroke, which I suspect has got to be standard knowledge. Your mouth doesn't look right, Mum, I told her. My mother examined her face in the mirror and was visibly affronted by the lopsided droop of her mouth, which she tried to correct with a few facial exercises, but her mouth was resolutely determined to droop on one side. I kid you not, my mother simply shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly, as if it was no big deal. It'll go away, she said resolutely. I probably pressed my face into the pillow last night rather hard, and it inadvertently pulled my mouth downwards. I'm not as young as I used to be, Juvenna. Things don't always bounce back the way they did when I was a lot younger. My collagen levels in the face are seriously depleted. My face is like an old mattress these days. Not much spring left in it, I'm afraid. When you get to my age, you'll understand all about the sagging that comes along when age hits you squarely in the face on the very first day you turn 40. Without apology, I must say. I was in disbelief with my mother's insouciant indifference. Surely she must realize she'd had a stroke. How could she behave like this? It was so typical of her to make light of a life-threatening situation, which, if not treated at once, could potentially happen all over again, and this time with more severe consequences. My mother wasn't stupid. It was one thing to be in denial of your weight or your age, but quite another to be in denial about your health conditions. And having a stroke that you refuse to admit is a stroke is borderline insane as far as I'm concerned. I clandestinely hoped people who worked at the bank with my mother would notice the strange droop of my mother's face and realize that she must have experienced a stroke. Maybe they would insist that she seek medical help at once. I suspected the stroke had happened in the early hours of the morning. It'll come right, my mother said resolutely, examining her face in the mirror and applying some ruby red lipstick to her lips. I'll be fine. It doesn't look that bad. You barely notice it, Juvenna. I don't agree. I think it's very conspicuous. You need to go and see someone, Mum. But trying to persuade my mother to do the right thing regarding her health was rather like throwing water on a duck's back. Nothing was going to sink in or penetrate her waterproof plumage. Mum, take a look in the mirror. Something's seriously wrong with your face, can't you see? Look at your mouth on the left-hand side. It's drooping down badly. It's in a strange position. And then what about your eyes? They're both looking in completely different angles. One eye is looking one way, the other another way. And I'm sorry, Mum, that's not normal. Your eyes have never done that before. It's got nothing to do with the elasticity of your skin, Mum. Anybody can see that. You need to understand one thing about my mother. She hated doctors with a burning passion and didn't trust them as far as you could throw them. My mother never went to a doctor, and let's just say even if she was on her last legs, I doubt she'd ever go willingly. I remember once when she had pneumonia and refused to go to a doctor until my Aunt Jane called one out for her all the way from the Rocky Mountains in Canada. We live in Los Angeles, so my aunt had to call a doctor in Los Angeles from such a long distance away, which was ridiculous, and was a first for Dr. Eidsman, I suspect. With my mother's apparent stroke, this was a similar emergency as far as I was concerned, and realizing the gravity of a medical situation that my mother was willfully choosing to ignore, and was viewing with as much disinterest and disdain as buying the wrong brand of Cheerios from the store, I knew what needed to be done. to get reinforcements on my side, to make my mother finally see sense, if that were at all possible. I sneakily phoned my Aunt Jane, all the way in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, to tell her what was going on with my mother, and how she'd woken up that morning with half her face looking disfigured and one side hanging downwards in a sizable droop. I absolutely knew my mother would not listen to me. I was 18 years old after all. Still a kid as far as my mother was concerned. She'd tell me I was only interested in fashion and boys. So what did I know about anything at all? When Dr. Eitzman arrived on the scene, when my Aunt Jane had called him about her bad bout of pneumonia, which occurred about 3 years prior to the stroke incident, I remember he was horrified to witness my mother's grievous condition, and wondered why my mother had not sought medical attention immediately. "Pneumonia is a serious business," he told her gravely. "This is no laughing matter. You're lucky to be alive. You shouldn't toy with your health, Mrs. Carverson." "It was just a silly little cold, Doctor, that's all," my mother insisted, while she was coughing and spluttering, like it was nobody's business, and working her way through 15 boxes of tissues that I had bought for her. "Why is everybody making such a dreadful fuss? I've just got the sniffles and a rather dry cough. That's all. I'll be absolutely fine." But fine she was not. She was immediately sent to hospital for her recovery, and was retained for a week in a hospital bed. When I went to visit her in hospital, she looked as miserable as an inmate on death row. She blamed Aunt Jane, of course, for calling the doctor out, but I suspect my Aunt Jane may very much have saved her life. Once again history was repeating itself, as I suspected it would, but I never thought a health drama would ensue as quickly as it did, especially under our roof only 3 years later. I've always believed that lightning can very definitely strike in the same place twice. Indeed, I know a friend of my mother's who was struck by lightning 3 times in a row. His name is Rory Thomas, and I know for a fact that he's rather proudly framed the clothes he was wearing when he was struck by lightning in a large picture frame in the hallway of his home. All his clothes in this visibly explicit display are singed and very badly burnt, with ragged holes and frays in the fabric. He says every time people visit his house, they stare in abject horror at the picture frame of his clothes in the hallway, and marvel at how it was possible he could have survived a lightning strike like that, when his clothes are obviously badly burned. It's a great conversation piece for all his dinner guests, I'm told. He seems incredibly pleased with the fact that he's fought Mother Nature 3 times and won. That's how he clearly sees it. I asked him why he thought he'd been struck so many times by lightning, and he believes some people are more predisposed to being struck by lightning than others. He thinks he's one of those unfortunate people who seems to attract lightning. In my mother's current health crisis, I was stuck between a rock and a hard place, so I decided to phone my Aunt Jane, all the way in the Canadian Rockies, to tell her the dreadful, rather sobering news, and that my mother's face had gone all funny, and her eyes were a bit odd. I knew my mother wouldn't be remotely amused by what I had done so treacherously behind her back, but that couldn't be helped. She would be furious, and she certainly had been that morning, when I had attempted to call an ambulance out. But she had stopped me in the process, looking at me with glaring eyes like a snarling cat, and saying to me, "Juvenna, don't you dare even think about it." I had a sense that if anyone could persuade my mother to seek medical attention, it would of course be her her non-identical twin sister, Aunt Jane, which was why I called her. But I did so from the neighbour's house, so my mother couldn't witness my traitorous call. "What do you mean your mother's face has gone all funny, and her eyes are odd?" asked Aunt Jane. "Is she still walking around normally and talking?" "It's hard to explain, Aunt Jane. She's perfectly normal, in a manner of speaking. She's her usual mulishly stubborn self, if you know what I mean. But her mouth's gone all wonky and droopy on one side of her face. Both her eyes are bulging like an insect and looking in different directions. It's not normal, Aunt Jane. I couldn't do that to my eyes, Aunt Jane. Even if I tried. I'm really worried about her. Something's not right." "Of course you're worried, Juvenna, and rightly so by the sounds of things. I'm so terribly glad you phoned me to inform me about this. Honestly, your mother is absolutely incorrigible. and not in a good way. That sister of mine is so damned bloody minded. She wouldn't know what was good for her if it slapped her brazenly in the face. I'm sure by the sounds of things your mother has had a stroke. It's important to get her to the doctor at once. I cannot stress this enough, Juvena. This is very serious. Your mother needs prompt medication to thin the blood, so this doesn't happen again. Because believe me, it will happen again if she doesn't get help now. If she has a blood clot, for example, it could easily reoccur. Ostensibly, her next stroke could be rather incapacitating. Some people who have strokes spend months in recuperation. Others, I hasten to say, are not so lucky. It does depend, of course, on what side of the brain has been affected by the stroke. But they're serious, and sometimes they can kill you outright. I knew something wasn't right, Aunt Jane. I'm so glad I phoned you. Mum wouldn't let me call an ambulance. Can you believe that? Your mother is the absolute end, Juvena. There are no words to describe her insouciance. Please can I speak to your mother right now? I know what she's like. That sister of mine is always in denial, pretending nothing is wrong, when something so very clearly is. Sometimes I despair with her. Remember when she had pneumonia 3 years ago? The way she behaved back then. It was deplorable. Common sense has never been one of her strong points, I'm afraid. Good job I've got enough for both of us. She needs a long, hard talking to, that's for sure. That's why I called you, Aunt Jane. But you better phone her yourself. I'm calling you from my neighbour's house, so Mum can't see me. She pulled out the plug from the landline when I tried to call an ambulance. Mum says her mouth will be normal again. She doesn't need a doctor, but I know she does. She needs help. And I just don't know what to do. I feel helpless. You should have seen how she lashed out at me when I tried to call the ambulance. She was absolutely furious, Aunt Jane. Aunt Jane let out an exasperated groan. I could hear her frustration in her disquieted voice. Even though I couldn't physically see her, I knew she was shaking her short head of grey curls that was neatly cropped around her face in a trendy avant-garde hairstyle, and the grey hair always made her grey-blue eyes look even more striking. If she had lived close to us, she would have driven over to our house in a heartbeat. But me, my mother, and my 5-year-old brother lived in Los Angeles, so there was a considerable geographical difference between where we lived and where Aunt Jane resided. She was the one that had visited us in Los Angeles as regular as clockwork, 5 times a year, and she would always spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with us, as my mother didn't want to travel all the way to Canada. My mother loathed travelling of any kind. She didn't like to spend time away from the creature comforts of home, and refused to leave our cat Dorothy in the charge of a stranger. I will not leave Dorothy unattended, she would insist. Dorothy is my baby. She needs to be watched over very carefully. She likes her chicken poached in bone broth, and no one knows how to do it like I do. It was ironic that Dorothy, our cat, was as bloody-minded as my mother was. Whenever we tried to take her to the vet, she'd cower under the bed and refuse to come out. My mother and her cat were reflections of each other, and I secretly suspect my mother saw herself in Dorothy, and was thus completely devoted to that cat. If she had to choose between me and my brother Lankum and Dorothy the cat, I'm afraid me and my brother would definitely draw the short straw. I kind of think my mother liked the geographical distance between her and Aunt Jane. It meant that Aunt Jane, being the sensitive, prudent one of the 2 twins, who had the propensity to be quite bossy towards my mother when she wanted to be, was far enough away for my mother to turn a deaf ear to Aunt Jane when she chose to. Aunt Jane made it her business to watch over our mother, because she knew only too well how obstinately resistant my mother could be towards any seasoned, well-meaning advice that would likely serve her very best interests. I was very glad I had successfully managed to rather discreetly sneak a phone call to Aunt Jane in the Rocky Mountains in Canada from the neighbour's house, as in those days cell phones were a luxury only the future promised. I was very grateful when I returned to the house that my mother had thankfully plugged the phone back into the socket. She answered it when it rang. She was expecting a call from a girlfriend of hers to arrange a lunch date. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I knew Aunt Jane was on the other end of the phone. and I could only pray that my mother would listen to the wizened advice of her salient twin sister. My mother spent a long while ranting with Aunt Jane on the phone, who was the antithesis to her in every single regard. My mother began waving the telephone in her hand furiously, as if she'd like it to give it a good old thump. It was very clear to me she was very annoyed by Aunt Jane's telephone call. Even to look at, they were considerably different. My unathletic mother was like a cuddly teddy bear, with a well-rounded abdomen and droopy shoulders. She dyed her hair auburn and always wore bright red lipstick and eyeliner. Aunt Jane never wore a stick of makeup a day in her life, was as slim as a string bean, with an enviable figure that made everything she wore look streamlined and neat. The two women may have shared the same womb together, but they couldn't have been more different if they'd tried. Having said that, both women had chosen never to get married, so I suppose they did have that in common. Me and my brother, whose name was Lankham, were both named after cosmetic houses. My mother wanted to call me an unusual name when I was born, so she looked at her skincare preparation that she was using on her face. She decided that Juvena would suit me fine. I don't say this proudly, but me and my brother Lankham were both products of my mother's one-night stands, which she deliberately engineered when she was ovulating, in the hope she'd fall pregnant. She was using the men for an ulterior motive that they knew nothing about, so she didn't have to acquire the expensive services of a sperm donation bank, which I'm sure in itself comes with a hefty price tag. She had purposely seduced these men to surreptitiously acquire their sperm, as this was a cheap, efficient way to get pregnant fast. My mother very briefly chose the men she wanted to father her children based on physical appearances, and then artfully seduced them, assuring them that she was on the contraceptive pill, so that she could pull the wool over their eyes, and they would be clueless that in their brief interaction with my mother, they had biologically sired a child that they themselves would never get to know about. As a consequence, I knew that me and my brother would never be able to find our birth fathers, but I had come to terms with that a long time ago, and it never really bothered me in the slightest. It was years later my mother decided to have another baby, engineering the same duplicitous scheme to acquire some sperm. I think she panicked when she was in her 40s, realizing that if she wanted a baby now, she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Luckily, the bank where my mother worked as a secretary was very generous towards pregnant women, giving them time off with full pay. My mother fell pregnant with my 5-year-old brother Lankham, and I was the one that was to take care of him after school, while my mother was working. I'd pick him up from the nursery every day, and we would walk home together hand in hand. I was smitten over my little brother, with his cute cherub face and his bright green eyes. No one in our family had green eyes, so maybe he had inherited these traits from his father, a father we'd never get to know. I think my mother and Aunt Jane's aversion towards men stems from the fact that both girls had grown up in a household where their battered mother was beaten to black and blue within an inch of her life by their bombastic, overbearing, very disagreeable father, who had such a foul mouth on him, no amount of bleach could have wiped his dirty words away. My mother told me that her mother was permanently going to the ER to have stitches or treatment for a broken nose, ankle, wrist, or a black eye, and so forth. The nurses at the local hospital knew exactly what was going on, and about the domestic abuse my grandmother was obviously being subjected to on a regular basis. They kept urging her to file a police report against her husband, but my grandmother point-blank refused to do so. It seems stubbornness runs through our family bloodline, and my mother's mulish ways were inherited from her own mother. One time my grandfather hit my grandmother so hard that several teeth flew out of her mouth and scattered all over their carpet, like tiny pieces of flying shrapnel. My mother and her sister Jane gathered them up together, thinking that their mother would get lots and lots of money from the tooth fairy that night if they soaked her teeth in a glass of water. But instead of attaining money in a glass of water, she ended up having to get dentures on all of her teeth. My grandfather never apologized to his wife for his pugnacious outbursts, but claimed my grandmother was at fault. She had provoked him to anger. "You stupid, stupid woman! If you weren't so damned harebrained and scatty with your head in the clouds all the time, I wouldn't get so hopping mad, would I?" he would complain. "You're the one that makes me lash out at you. because you make me hopping mad. I wouldn't normally lash out at a woman, but you're the one that rubs me up the wrong way. What happened to you is hardly my fault. You brought it on yourself." It would seem both my mother and Aunt Jane realised the real reason their long-suffering mother had stayed in the dysfunctional relationship for so long with their father was she was financially dependent on him. On the day he died from a sudden massive heart attack, my grandmother had celebrated her newfound freedom and independence. The life insurance and pension my grandfather had bequeathed her set her up for life. My mother told me that as my grandfather's coffin was lowered into the ground, no one shed a single tear for him, and after he was buried, the family looked sizably relieved, almost as if a huge weight had been lifted off their lives. When my mother told me this rather sad, disheartening story, I felt rather sorry for my grandfather. He had died without anyone grieving his loss, almost as if his life on this earth had been pretty meaningless. Apparently his own mother, who would have been my great-grandmother, had been at the funeral and had said, "Thank God he's gone. I never cared for my son very much. He was always such a bully." Which is damning as an indictment when your own mother fails to grieve your loss, which speaks volumes about how disagreeable my grandfather must have been in life. To all intents and purposes, both my mother and Aunt Jane were to see their demure, rather reticent mother become like a colourful butterfly emerging from a cocoon after her husband's demise. My grandmother had always been an excellent baker, and had blossomed. Many described her as looking as if she'd dropped 20 years overnight. She even ambitiously started up her own cake business, which would never have been possible if my grandfather was alive. She had thrived, enabling her to acquire confidence that had been sorely lacking in her marriage. She had believed her husband when he had vindictively accused her of being useless and nothing but a waste of space. In truth, my grandmother would say, if her husband was still alive, he'd barely recognise her any more, because gone was the shrinking Violet, who had successfully transformed herself into an assertive, very self-assured professional woman, who wouldn't suffer fools gladly. Well, not any more, that is. My mother always believed the negative influences her father had bestowed over their young lives had galvanised her desire to stay well away from marriage of any kind. So any relationships my mother had enjoyed with men had been fleeting, rather like ships passing through the night. She had liked it that way. Even when a couple of men had fallen for her hard, she had pushed them away, as such was her dreadful fear of getting seriously entangled with a man. For in my mother's distorted, rather misguided opinion, if there was one bad apple in the barrel, then they were likely all bad. I think she believed if she got married, the man in question would mysteriously morph into my grandfather, and then begin to abuse her. Aunt Jane seemed to have a similar attitude towards men, as her bitter experience with my father had been badly soiled by the tempestuous relationship he had shared with their mother. So both women had distorted views on marriage, which was clearly apparent. Unlike my mother, Aunt Jane had never shown any particular interest in men. She had no desire to have children, although she loved the bones of me and my brother Lancome. I guess when children are growing up, they're very impressionable, and the way they are raised can have far-reaching consequences on their future choices in adulthood. I think in my mother and Aunt Jane's case, it's safe to say their father's pugnacious outbursts, temper tantrums, rages, and constant degrading of their mother had sworn them off men for life. From the moment my mother had left college, she became fiercely independent and worked as a secretary for a CEO at a large American bank. Aunt Jane was very good with her hands and quite domesticated like her mother had been, so she worked her magic on the sewing machine and had started up her own business making dresses for an exclusive designer shop, which included stunning bridal gowns for brides and elegant evening dresses for glamorous functions. Aunt Jane was sensible and efficient. She ate 3 meals a day, with no in-between snacking. She took good care of herself, and at the first sign of a sneeze or a high raging temperature, she'd visit her doctor for a checkup. Where she was wise and discerning, my mother regretfully chose to be naively ignorant. I knew categorically that if my mother would listen to anyone, I hoped it would be with my Aunt Jane. "For God's sake, Zoe, what on earth has got into you?" said Aunt Jane. "I've just been on the telephone to Juvenna. She tells me you woke up with your face all disfigured, or should I say drooping on one side, and I believe your eyes are rather odd. Now I'm extremely worried about your welfare, Zoe. I think you've had a stroke. You need to seek medical attention at once." "I can't believe Juvenna went behind my back like this and phoned you all the way in the Rocky Mountains to tell you this. Honestly, that daughter of mine is the end. She's a liability. She's overreacting. There's nothing wrong with me at all. I probably got my face tangled up in a pillow and was lying in an awkward position. You know what it's like." "No, I do not know what it's like, Zoe," protested Aunt Jane. "Honestly, Zoe, you are the end. You and I well know that you don't wake up in the morning with one side of your face looking lopsided. My guess is you must have had a stroke. And if you don't get to the doctors quick, you risk having another one, and that's terribly dangerous. I suspect they'll run some tests on you, give you some blood thinners like warfarin to prevent another stroke. But you need to see someone at once. I don't want to lose my only sister. Why don't you give Dr. Eitzman a call? That doctor's absolutely amazing. He'll know what to do. I'll phone him myself if you like I did last time when you had pneumonia." "Oh, for goodness sake, Jane, would you please stop fussing? Why on earth do you always have to overreact? Make such a big deal out of something that is so insignificant and so unimportant. You and Juvenna are both made of the same cloth. You're like two peas in a pod. You can't resist putting your nose into everybody else's business. Thank goodness you don't live next door to me. I'd be in purgatory if you did. I told you I'm perfectly fine, Jane. I am very annoyed with Juvenna. I can't believe how sneaky she was, going behind my back like that to phone you from the neighbour's house. She's making you panic for no reason at all. I have not had a stroke. The idea is ludicrous. I'm not even that old. I'm in my 40s, for goodness sake. People can have strokes at any age, Zoe. They're not just reserved for the elderly, you know. Now, please don't get mad at Juvenna. She's looking out for you, as am I. And it's a good thing that we are, because you're clearly not taking good care of yourself. I'm warning you, Zoe. If you don't go and see Dr. Eitzman, I'm going to get the next flight from Canada and drag you to see him myself, as quickly as I possibly can. Is that understood? All right, I will go and see Dr. Eitzman, if it makes you happy, Jane. I'll make an appointment to see him, but there is nothing wrong with me, I can assure you of that. You promise me you will go, Zoe. I'm trusting you to do the right thing. Now, I don't want you letting me down. I know what you're like about doctors, Zoe. Even when we were children, every time you went to the doctors, you would run and hide. You know that doctors want the very best for you. But Dr. Eitzman is a darling. You'll be in very good hands with him. Honestly, I don't know why you have such a bee in your bonnet about doctors. I believed my mother when she claimed to have been to see Dr. Eitzman. I really did. She said she'd suffered a mini-stroke and that it wasn't a big deal. She returned home with blood thinners. Well, that's what she told me anyway. She said the people at work thought she might have had a stroke and had encouraged her to seek medical help. Happy now, she said, making a face at me. It's no big deal. Dr. Eitzman says I will be absolutely fine. Little did I know that this was a barefaced lie on my mother's part, and she was quite literally playing Russian roulette with her life. The madly annoying woman had not gone to see the doctor at all. What did Dr. Eitzman say? I asked her, because more fool me, I actually believed her lofty story. Haven't you heard a word I've said, Juvenna? Why don't you listen? Where are your ears? If I didn't know any better, I'd say you didn't own any. As I was saying, Dr. Eitzman said I'd be fine. My mother lied. He's given me some meds that I'm going to take. I'll be as right as rain. I had phoned Aunt Jane to tell her the great news. My aunt had sighed with relief, telling me she would phone my mother in an hour or so to find out what Dr. Eitzman had said about her health. Thank God, said Aunt Jane. I cannot believe we got your mother to listen to us, Juvenna. It was you, Aunt Jane. You're the only one that can ever talk sense to her. Well, she has been my twin all my life, has she not? So I know your mother's ways rather well. When they say there is nothing new under the sun, they're not lying about that. I'm afraid, Juvenna, your mother is rather suspicious of the medical profession. And it didn't help when Mr. Donnelly died all those long years ago, because the doctor prescribed him the wrong medication. And when your mother heard that, she decided she'd never trust a doctor again. Your mother had a soft spot for Mr. Donnelly, you know. Who's Mr. Donnelly? I asked. I've never heard of him before. You wouldn't know him, love. He lived next door to us long before you were born. He went to the doctor for some medication. The doctor prescribed him the wrong stuff. He died at 32 years old. His wife was absolutely devastated, as you can imagine. It was proven to be a medical error on the doctor's part. And well, that story hit your mother very hard growing up. Mr. Donnelly had a soft spot for your mother. She'd go over to his house and they would play cards together. You know what your mother's like, fixated on cards. And Mr. Donnelly was too. So I guess they had a connection there. Mr. Donnelly didn't warm to me like he did with your mother. But after he died, your mother categorically insisted that no doctors could ever be trusted. No wonder Mum avoids doctors like the plague, I said. Well, the main thing is, love, she's on the blood-thinning medications now. She's been evaluated by a doctor. It sounds like she had a mini-stroke, but you can never be too careful, can you? I'm proud of you, Juvenna, for promptly phoning me like you did. You might have saved your mother's life, you know. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.